I love science fiction, especially on TV. But to be honest, if you watch enough of it, you will come across the same kinds of ideas again and again. I mean, there are only so many things you can do in space in 45 minutes, to be honest. One of the most common themes that you keep coming across is time travel. Our heroes are sent back in time, and it usually is back in time, sometimes as a result of an accident, or sometimes just to avert some terrible disaster, or sometimes just for the fun of it. But when you have time travel, you have the same kind of problems coming up again and again. What happens if you do something in the past that affects the future? Say, if I go back in time and stop my parents ever meeting, will I be born? And if I'm not born, who's going to go back in time to stop my parents meeting? It can really mess up your brain if you think about it too much. Most science fiction tries to come with some answer to this. Some are more convincing than others, but my favourite is from Doctor Who. In one episode, the Doctor tries to explain how he in the past can know what someone is going to say in the future. There's a clip of it on YouTube. I'm going to post the link just below this video, just down there. So if you want to have a look at it, do take a look. But if not, I'll tell you what the Doctor says. The Doctor says this. People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect. But actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more of a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Timey-wimey stuff. In other words, it's really complicated. You can't really get your head around it, and that's the point. There's a bit more to it than meets the eye. Timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. And I reckon the Doctor is right, actually, and we only have to look at our Bible passage to see why. You might have spotted that this Bible passage contains the shortest verse in the Bible. Verse 35, Jesus wept. Jesus' friend Lazarus has died, and he's confronted with the grief of Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, and Jesus is overcome with emotion himself. Here we see Jesus who stands beside those who are hurting and weeps with them. Here we see Jesus who knows what it's like to experience loss and grief. It's a good reminder at a time like this that Jesus doesn't stand aloof over a hurting world, but that when we weep, Jesus weeps with us. But Jesus doesn't just weep in this story, does he? He does something. He calls out, and Lazarus is brought out of the tomb, from death to life. Jesus brings joy out of despair and turns mourning into gladness. Which is wonderful. Amazing for Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But it leaves us, perhaps, with a question. Because if Jesus could do this for his friend Lazarus, couldn't he do this for us too? I mean, not just us, but if Jesus can raise the dead by the power of his voice, couldn't he just snap his fingers and eradicate coronavirus? And while he's at it, Ebola and malaria and AIDS too? This is a big question. And it's a really important one, but I don't think it's quite the question that this passage is asking. And I think if we're asking this question, we haven't quite read this passage right. Because it isn't just that Jesus turns up, clicks his fingers, and everyone is happy again. He doesn't come in and solve everyone's problems. He doesn't come in and solve all the problems even for his three friends. It isn't like he hears that Lazarus is ill and says, "Right lads, let's go and sort it out," and goes and does it straight away. Actually, it all goes horribly wrong. Lazarus dies. It's that kind of terrible, I can't believe this is actually happening feeling, one which many of us might have experienced in the last couple of weeks. And even after Lazarus is brought back to life, his problems don't go away. If you were going to read on a bit further, you'd read in John 12 that Lazarus becomes the subject of an assassination plot. Because of what Jesus did, John tells us that a plot is made against Jesus' life to arrest him and to kill him, one which is ultimately successful. Jesus is not in the business of making life easy and comfortable for us. That's not what he's about. You know, it's really easy to read the Gospels and to see Jesus going here and there, healing the sick and raising the dead and making people whole again, and think that's what Jesus was sent to do. Except it really wasn't. maybe in part, but not wholly, what Jesus was sent to do. Jesus isn't in the business of making our problems disappear. He's not a quick fix for a happy life or a miracle drug for all of life's hurt and pain. Life is more complicated than that. What Jesus is about is bigger than that. This is where that timey-wimey thing comes in. Because in a couple of weeks we're going to be celebrating Easter. Now I can't imagine any of us will be celebrating it in a way that we've done before. It's going to be quite strange and quite different for us. But I hope you're going to be celebrating it in some way. After all, Easter is the great festival, the great celebration, the great feast of our faith. It's the day that we remember that Jesus died and rose again, was raised to new life. Now, it'd be easy to think that what happens to Jesus is a kind of echo of what's happened to Lazarus, like an echo travelling through time and through John's Gospel. I might even think of all this timey-wimey, hubbly-bubbly stuff, that the echo is travelling back through time, and that is possible. Except when Jesus is raised from the dead, it's on a completely different scale than when Lazarus is brought from death to life. When Jesus is raised from the dead, this is the start of something amazing, the start of something huge, the age to come, eternal life, the new creation, whatever you want to call it, this is the start of it. It's the first line of a chapter of a book that the whole world has been waiting for. Everything that God has promised comes into being when Jesus is raised from the dead. An end to hurt, an end to pain, an end to disease and death, a future of life and hope and promise. It starts there, and it's all made real in Jesus. No wonder that he says that he is the resurrection and the life. Jesus doesn't go around fixing our problems one by one, making life easy for us. Because what Jesus is about is renewing life itself, setting the world to rights once and for all. And it happens on that first Easter day. Not just for Jesus, but for all of us, for all the universe. It's just, well, it's a timey-wimey thing. Jesus' resurrection is exactly the same event that will happen in the future of all that is to come. It's just separated in time. It's like the first line of a book, the first apple from a tree that will produce much more fruit, the deposit on a house that will be paid off. The rest is to come. The clock is ticking and nothing is going to stop it. It's just separated in time. And if your head is starting to spin and you've really had enough of timey-wimey things, then I don't blame you. The whole point is, it's really complicated. You don't have to fully understand it. You just have to remember this. Jesus' resurrection is the sign that the world will be set right. A sure and certain sign. Because what God is doing and has done cannot be stopped. But it also means we see signs of God's future everywhere. We see signs of God's new creation. It's like water gushing from cracks in a dam split before one day the dam bursts and we're flooded with all of the good that God is bringing about. This is what we see when Lazarus is raised from the dead. Like God's new life just cannot be held back, even before Jesus is raised to new life himself. This is what we see when Jesus heals the sick and makes people whole. This is what we see when sin is forgiven and lives are transformed. God isn't dishing out favours on a case-by-case basis, but it's the power of God bursting forth from a future that we will share together, but which cannot be held back, cannot be held in the future, but is making its way into our lives now. Because this is what we see today as well. This is what we see when people are restored to good health, when the broken are made whole, when lives are turned around, when strangers are welcomed, when the poor and the marginalised are cared for and are lifted up. This is what we see when we see others laying down their well-being, laying down their health for the sake of others. This is what we see when God brings joy out of despair. And that's a sign of the coming day, that the world will be set right. That day is not here yet. there is still pain and hurt. You don't need me to tell you that. We can see it as we look around the world. But there are signs that those days are numbered. There are signs that the dam is about to break. Shafts of light which point to a day of glorious sunshine ahead of us. Amen.